Welcome to Prime Field. The most underrated player in America is not always the one with the loudest stat line. Sometimes the real story lives in the gap between impact and attention. In the 2025-26 season, that gap has a name, Ashlynn Shade. Her numbers do not resemble a national awards campaign. Her role does not resemble a headline act. And yet, on a roster crowded with star power, Shade keeps surfacing in the moments that decide possessions. And, in time, seasons. This documentary follows a single question. How does a player become essential while remaining largely unrecognized? The answer begins with a framework designed to measure what the standard narratives often miss. The research brief proposes a formula called the underrated index. Its premise is direct. The recognition gap is not noise, it is information. The index weights three forces. First, production plus role difficulty. How efficiently value is created when touches are limited and rhythm is rationed. Second, winning impact. The measurable ways a player shifts possession outcomes on a contending team. Third, the inverse of media hype. How far the public narrative lags behind what the film and the numbers keep confirming. In that structure, scoring volume is not dismissed, it is contextualized, and within that context, Shade emerges as a primary case study. A player whose contribution can be large enough to matter deeply, while remaining quiet enough to be overlooked. That tension defines the next layer of the story. Award conversations often gravitate toward visible peaks, points per game, highlight reels, and the players who live on the floor for 30-plus minutes. The brief argues that the overlooked layer is different. It is starter-level influence compressed into smaller windows. Shade's 2025-26 usage context reflects that compression. The brief cites 23.9 minutes per game, with 10 starts and 10 games played. On paper, that can read like a supporting role. On film, it resembles something else. A player trusted to initiate, connect, and stabilize lineups that already have primary scorers. The comparison inside the brief sharpens the contrast. Paige Beckers and AZ Fudd are cited at 27.6 minutes per game in 2025. Names that naturally dominate the spotlight. Shade operates closer to the edges of that spotlight, not outside the system, but inside it, where the work is structural and the credit is scarce. From there, the argument shifts to what Shade actually produces inside those constraints. The brief presents Shade's season line as follows: 8.3 points per game on 38.6% shooting from the field, 34.9% from three, and 80% at the free throw line, alongside 3.3 rebounds and 2.7 assists per game. Those numbers do not announce dominance, they signal discipline. They describe a player functioning as a later option in the hierarchy, while still converting possessions at a usable rate. The brief also cites a true shooting percentage of .558 on her season volume, framing it as evidence that her production is not random output. It is controlled value, created without requiring offensive ownership. In a system where touches are contested by multiple stars, efficiency becomes a form of leverage. And the most powerful leverage in modern college basketball often starts with spacing. The brief anchors Shade's perimeter identity in a prior season number, 41.1% from three-point range last year. A 40% perimeter shooter changes geometry. Regardless of scoring totals, defenses cannot treat that as background. The brief's point is not that Shade is a one-season shooter, it is that the spacing threat is durable enough to shape how opponents guard UConn's primary actions, and how teammates find downhill lanes. In that architecture, Shade's impact can appear indirect, but indirect does not mean minor. A shooter with gravity pulls defenders into decisions. A defender in decision-making mode gives up something, a step of help, a late rotation, a softer closeout. Those are the margins that allow stars to become efficient stars. This is where the brief introduces a central idea. On elite rosters, a player like Shade can pay a connector tax. The underrated index, as described, is designed to capture an asymmetry. A high-usage scorer on a middling team can dominate narratives. A lower-usage connector on a title contender can disappear inside the machine, even while the machine depends on that connector to run cleanly. Shade's environment is defined by competition for possessions. The brief cites UConn's top scorers in the same ecosystem. Beckers at 18.1 points per game, Fudd at 18.1, and Sarah Strong at 17.5. Those numbers clarify the reality. Every shot attempt for a fourth option is a shot not taken by a featured scorer. Every extra dribble is a disruption to timing. Every low-quality possession has an outsized cost. In that environment, the connector's job becomes harder to see and harder to reward, until a proof moment forces the hidden value into plain view. For Shade, the brief frames that moment around a single game. The brief identifies an inflection point. UConn's 79-51 road win over number 16 USC on December 13, 2025. The game's defensive context is explicit. USC was held to 30.2% shooting. UConn converted 20 turnovers into 26 points. Inside that statement win, Shade delivered a line that looked nothing like background support. The brief cites 15 points on 6-for-11 shooting, including 3 for 6 from 3 in 27 minutes, with 4 rebounds and 4 assists. The significance is not purely the points. It is the way the points arrived, as efficiency, as timing, as spacing that held, and decisions that did not break the offense. Within the logic of the index, USC becomes validation. This was not a player demanding volume to prove value. This was a player expanding impact when the stage demanded precision. From that proof moment, the brief pivots outward, toward the larger comparison the index is meant to provoke. The underrated index asks a question that conventional rankings often avoid: who wins possessions, rather than who simply accumulates numbers. The brief introduces a contrast. Haley Van Lith is cited at 5.8 assists per game, paired with the idea of award season attention. Kansas's Worthy is referenced as playmaking support in a championship context. Shades' case sits between those poles. She's described as a facilitative scorer, a player who can score without hijacking the offense, and can pass without reducing scoring threat. That archetype is rarely marketed as a centerpiece, but in team-building terms, it is often the piece that keeps possessions from collapsing, especially when opponents load up on the stars. By the brief's framing, that is the gap. The index does not deny that stars drive winning. It argues that some players drive the conditions that let stars dominate, which brings the story to its measured conclusion. Not a coronation, but a verdict. The brief's final judgment is careful. By its underrated index formula, production plus role, difficulty plus winning impact minus media hype. Ashlynn Shade is positioned as a top 5 most underrated player nationally. The brief leaves an open debate about whether she is the most underrated or whether that label belongs to a similar connector in a different system. But it also draws a firm line. When UConn's season is ultimately analyzed, the story will not be complete without the players who made the roster's star power functional, the ones who provided spacing, timing, and connective decisions when possessions tightened. Shade's legacy, in this framework, is not built on volume. It is built on structural value. And in the world of championship teams, structural value has a way of outlasting the narratives that ignored it, until the results make the truth impossible to miss.